It was a quiet evening, and the house seemed emptier than usual. Emily sat on the couch, her fingers absently scrolling through her phone, not really focusing on anything. The silence in the house was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. Her husband, David, was working late again, and her mother-in-law, Linda, was out at her usual yoga class. This left Emily alone with her father-in-law, Robert, the man who had become an unsettling presence in her life over the past few months. Emily had married David 3 years ago, full of hope and excitement for their future together. They weren't rich, but they had each other, and for Emily, that had always seemed enough. David was kind and hardworking, but he was distant, too focused on work and constantly avoiding the one issue that had begun to define their marriage: children. After a year of trying, there had been no success. Emily felt the pressure mounting from all sides, especially from Linda, who was always gently prodding her about doctor appointments and fertility tests. Robert, on the other hand, had always seemed more laid back. A man in his early 50s, retired from his construction business, he was quiet and calm, never showing much emotion. He had the air of someone who had seen a lot in life but chose to say little. In the beginning, Emily had appreciated his calmness. Unlike Linda's constant advice and David's silent retreat into work, Robert never asked her about the baby issue. He just stayed in the background, watching, observing. But that had started to change. One evening, not long after Linda had left for her yoga class and David was working late as usual, Emily had been in the kitchen preparing dinner when Robert had entered the room. There was nothing particularly unusual about the moment. He often came in to check on what was cooking or to ask if she needed help. But that night, there had been something different in his eyes. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it made Emily's skin crawl. She had brushed it off, thinking maybe she was just imagining things. However, the next time they were alone together, Robert's behavior became more direct. He had made an offhand comment about how hard it must be for her and David to deal with the pressure of having children. Emily, caught off guard, had agreed, expressing her frustration and exhaustion with the constant questions from the family. Robert had nodded sympathetically, but then, in a low voice, he'd said something that made her blood run cold. "You know, if you ever need help, I'm always here." Emily had frozen, unsure how to respond. His words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and she had quickly excused herself, pretending she hadn't understood his meaning, but deep down, she knew. She had seen the way he had looked at her that night in the kitchen, and she had felt the shift in his demeanor. It was subtle, but it was there. As the weeks passed, Robert's advances became more blatant. He would find excuses to be near her when no one else was around, brushing against her as he passed or standing too close during conversations. He never said anything outright, but the tension in the air was thick, and Emily began to dread the moments when they were alone together. She couldn't bring herself to tell David. How could she? He was already under so much pressure from work, and Emily feared that confronting the issue would tear the family apart. So she kept silent, hoping that Robert would stop on his own. But he didn't stop. One evening, while David was at a work party and Linda was at her usual yoga class, Emily found herself alone in the house with Robert again. She had just finished taking a shower and was dressed in a loose-fitting t-shirt and shorts. The weather was warm, and she wanted to be comfortable. She was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when she felt a presence behind her. Before she could turn around, she felt arms wrap around her waist, pulling her close. Her heart raced as she turned in shock to find Robert standing there, his face inches from hers. The look in his eyes was dark, predatory. Emily tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Robert, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice shaking. His response was chilling. "I'm helping you," he said, his voice low and calm, as if what he was doing was perfectly reasonable. "You want a baby, don't you?" Emily's mind went blank. She couldn't comprehend what was happening, couldn't believe that this man, her father-in-law, was insinuating what she feared the most. She pushed him away with all the strength she could muster, but he was stronger. His grip on her wrist was firm as he forced her against the counter, his other hand moving to cover her mouth when she tried to scream. Time seemed to slow as Robert's words echoed in her ears. "You'll thank me later," he whispered, his breath hot against her skin. Emily struggled, tears streaming down her face, but it was no use. Robert was determined, and there was no one around to help her. The house was empty, and her cries went unheard. When it was over, Robert stood up, adjusting his clothes as if nothing had happened. Emily remained frozen in place, her mind numb with shock. She couldn't move, couldn't think. The reality of what had just occurred was too much to process. Robert glanced at her one last time before leaving the room, his voice casual as he said, "You'll understand one day. It's for the family." Emily collapsed to the floor, her body trembling with the weight of what had just happened. She couldn't breathe, couldn't stop the sobs that racked her chest. The shame, the disgust, the fear, it all overwhelmed her. How could she face David? How could she look him in the eyes knowing what had just happened? And how could she tell him the truth? The days that followed were a blur of pain and confusion. Emily avoided Robert as much as possible, but every time she saw him, she felt the weight of his presence pressing down on her. He acted as if nothing had changed, as if the horrific encounter in the kitchen had never happened. But Emily knew the truth, and it was slowly killing her inside. David, oblivious to the tension between his wife and his father, continued to work long hours, leaving Emily alone in the house more often than not. Linda remained focused on her yoga and community activities, never suspecting the darkness lurking within her own home. Emily felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of the secret she carried. And then, one night, it happened again. David was working late, and Linda was out at another yoga class. Emily had been sitting in the living room, trying to distract herself with a book, when she heard the door to her bedroom creak open. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Her heart pounded in her chest as she heard footsteps approaching. Robert's shadow loomed over her, and before she could react, he grabbed her arm, pulling her into the bedroom. This time, there was no pretense of gentleness. Robert was rough, aggressive, and Emily's feeble attempts to resist only fueled his determination. She cried out, but no one was there to hear her. The door was closed and the house was silent. When it was over, Robert left the room without a word, leaving Emily shattered on the floor. The humiliation, the guilt, the self-loathing, it was too much to bear. She felt like she was drowning, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Every time she looked at David, she felt a stab of guilt, knowing that she was keeping this horrible secret from him. But how could she tell him? How could she destroy their marriage, their family? Weeks passed, and Emily's mental state continued to deteriorate. She felt like a shell of the person she used to be, consumed by fear and guilt. And then, one morning, she discovered she was pregnant. The news should have been a joyous occasion. After all, it was what David's family had wanted for so long. But for Emily, it was a nightmare. She knew the truth. The baby wasn't David's. It was Robert's. The man who had violated her, who had taken advantage of her vulnerability, was now the father of her child. Emily was faced with an impossible choice. Should she tell David the truth and risk destroying their marriage? Or should she stay silent, pretend that everything was normal, and raise the child as if it were David's? In the end, Emily chose silence. She couldn't bear the thought of losing David, of tearing their family apart, but the weight of the secret she carried was unbearable. Every time she looked at her growing belly, she felt a deep sense of shame and guilt. The child inside her was a constant reminder of the horror she had endured, a living symbol of the dark secret she would have to carry for the rest of her life. As the months passed, Emily became more and more distant from David. Their once loving relationship had become strained, full of unspoken tension and unresolved pain. David, oblivious to the truth, was thrilled at the prospect of becoming a father. but Emily couldn't share in his joy. When their son was born, the house was filled with celebration. David's family rejoiced, and for a moment it seemed like the darkness had lifted. But for Emily, the nightmare was far from over. Every time she looked at her son, she was reminded of the man who had violated her, the man who had destroyed her sense of self. And so, Emily continued to live in silence, trapped in a web of lies and guilt, unable to break free from the darkness that had consumed her life.